Introduction. Differences in meaning for Jesus' audience versus Luke's audience. In Luke 11:33 through 36 and its parallel in Matthew 6:22 through 23, Jesus uses the metaphor of the eye as the lamp of the body. However, the way his words were understood differed between his original audience and Luke's audience. Differences in cultural, religious, and social context. Jesus' original audience was the first century Jew. Jesus' Jewish audience would have been familiar with the concept of light and darkness as spiritual metaphors from the Hebrew scriptures. See Psalm 119, verse 105, and Isaiah 60, verses 1 and 2. For them, the healthy eye symbolized a heart devoted to God, while the unhealthy eye symbolized greed, selfishness, and spiritual blindness. Light was understood as a metaphor for purity, divine truth, and righteousness, while darkness often represented sin, ignorance, and evil. In Luke's audience, the Greco-Roman world, Luke's audience was primarily the Gentiles and would have had different associations with light and darkness. They may have connected these ideas more to philosophical or moral teachings on knowledge and enlightenment. The concept of the eye as a moral indicator would resonate with ideas in Greco-Roman philosophy, where the eye was often seen as reflecting one's inner character and moral clarity. Luke's inclusion of this teaching would emphasize the need for inner transformation and alignment with divine truth in broader, more universal sense. Closing thought. While the metaphor of the healthy versus unhealthy eye carries deep spiritual significance in both contexts, the way it was understood by Jesus' original audience and Luke's audience sheds light on the different ways cultural, religious, and social backgrounds shape our interpretation of Scripture. Differences. Point number 1. Jesus' original audience, the first century Jewish listeners in Palestine. Key factors. Predominantly Jewish. Jesus' original listeners were mainly Jewish peasants, religious leaders, and disciples, all deeply immersed in Jewish culture and religious practices. Familiar with Jewish wisdom literature, they would have recognized the metaphor of the healthy eye and evil eye as common Jewish idioms, symbolizing generosity versus greed, as we see in Proverbs 28:22 and Deuteronomy 15:9. Expectation of the Messiah. Many in Jesus' audience were expecting a political Messiah who would free them from Roman oppression. Instead, Jesus focused on spiritual transformation, calling people to a deeper relationship with God. Cultural context. Wealth and God's favor. Wealth was often perceived as a sign of God's blessing, and Jesus challenged this belief by teaching that true wealth was found in spiritual devotion and generosity, not in material riches. Light versus darkness. The concept of light and darkness was common in Jewish apocalyptic thought, where light symbolized divine truth. Goodness, while darkness represented ignorance, sin, and evil. See the Dead Sea Scrolls in Isaiah 9:2. How they likely understood the saying. Matthew's version, 6:22 through 23, the original audience likely understood it as a moral teaching about devotion to God, generosity, and the importance of avoiding greed, emphasizing spiritual clarity and righteousness. In Luke's version, Luke 11:33 through 36, Luke's audience would have understood it as a call to spiritual awareness and a challenge to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, accepting his teachings as a path to spiritual life. Resistance from religious leaders. Those resistant to Jesus, such as the Pharisees, scribes, and skeptics, would have heard this saying as a rebuke. For them, rejecting Jesus was seen as choosing spiritual blindness, a choice for darkness over light. Closing thought. Jesus' teachings, particularly regarding the healthy eye and evil eye, were not just cultural reflections. They were invitations to radically rethink spiritual priorities. For his Jewish audience, this was a call to move beyond materialism and embrace spiritual transformation. The challenge remains for us today to choose the light of Christ over the darkness of worldly desires and spiritual blindness. Differences. Point number 2. Luke's audience, primarily Gentile Christians in the Greco-Roman world. Key factors. More diverse audience. Luke's audience was primarily Gentile Christians, many of whom had converted from pagan backgrounds, alongside some Jewish Christians who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Less familiar with Jewish idioms. The phrase evil eye would not have the same immediate connection to greed for Gentiles as it did for Jews, who were familiar with Jewish wisdom literature. However, the light and darkness metaphor would resonate more strongly due to Greek philosophical traditions, which often associated light with truth and knowledge. Roman imperial context. Many Gentiles were involved in pagan mystery religions that emphasized illumination and spiritual enlightenment, drawing parallels to the concept of receiving divine truth. In a society dominated by emperor worship and polytheism, Gentiles were accustomed to competing religious claims, making the exclusive claim of Christ as the light a powerful message. How they likely understood the saying? Less about material wealth and more about spiritual enlightenment. Many Gentiles would not interpret this saying as addressing material greed versus generosity, but rather as a message about moral and spiritual clarity. They may have connected Jesus' words to philosophical ideas about knowledge and truth, such as Plato's concept of the light of reason, or the enlightenment that comes through knowledge. A warning against rejecting Christ's truth. Luke emphasizes Jesus as the light. His Gentile audience would likely see this saying as a call to fully embrace Christ and his teachings. Those who resist the gospel were seen as choosing darkness, ignorance, and sin, or continuing in their pagan practices rather than the light of salvation and truth in Christ. Application to their daily lives. Many Gentile Christians lived in a world of persecution and competing worldviews. This passage would serve as a reminder to remain spiritually pure and avoid being swayed back into idolatry or sinful behaviors that they had once practiced. Closing thought. For Luke's Gentile audience, the metaphor of light and darkness was not just about material wealth, but about the contrast between truth and ignorance, salvation and sin. And Jesus' call to embrace the light was a call to spiritual clarity and moral purity in a world filled with competing ideologies. Conclusion. Differences in meaning for Jesus' audience versus Luke's audience. Aspect. Cultural background. Jesus' original audience, the first century Jews in Palestine, primarily Jewish familiar with Torah and wisdom literature, were deeply connected to Jewish idioms, customs, and expectations of the Messiah. And Luke's audience, the Greco-Roman Christians, were Gentile converts from pagan or philosophical traditions, exposed to various religious beliefs, including mystery religions and philosophical ideas about truth and knowledge. An understanding of the eye metaphor. Jesus' audience, the metaphor of the healthy eye versus the evil eye would be understood as a reflection of generosity versus greed, rooted in Jewish wisdom teachings. In Luke's audience, the metaphor would have been interpreted more as a moral clarity versus corruption, focusing on how one's perception of truth shapes their life. Understanding of light versus darkness. Jesus' audience, the Jewish listeners, would connect light and darkness with apocalyptic themes, symbolizing good versus evil, God versus Satan, and spiritual clarity versus blindness. In Luke's audience, Gentile Christians would connect light and darkness with philosophical themes of truth versus ignorance and the need for spiritual enlightenment through Christ. The primary message heard in Jesus' audience, a warning against greed, materialism, and spiritual blindness, encouraging trust in God over wealth and the pursuit of righteousness. In Luke's audience, a call to fully accept Christ's light, reject spiritual deception, and embrace the truth of Christ, leaving behind pagan beliefs and philosophies. Application. Jesus' audience would embrace righteousness, trust God over marital wealth, and live in a life of devotion to Him. And Luke's audience would reject spiritual deception, embrace the truth of Christ, and remain committed to the light of Christ in a world filled with competing beliefs. Conclusion. While Jesus' original Jewish audience would have understood the eye metaphor as a call to generosity and single-hearted devotion to God, Luke's audience, consisting of Gentile Christians, would have seen it more as a call to spiritual enlightenment and truth through Christ. Luke's version emphasizes the urgency of accepting Jesus and his message in the light of Christ, while Matthew's version focuses more on the importance of righteousness and living in alignment with God's will in daily life. Closing thought. Both audiences, though culturally and religiously distinct, are called to examine what they focus on, the light of Christ or the darkness of sin. The challenge is for us today is the same, to let our eyes be healthy, reflecting the light of God's truth, and to walk in the light of Christ, rejecting anything that leads us into darkness. Historical context, point number 1. The healthy eye and the evil eye in Jewish thought. The eye is a conduit reflecting light. In Jewish thought, the eye was seen not only as a physical organ, but a window to the soul. The way one looked at the world and others reflected their inner spiritual and moral state. The healthy eye, or haplos in the Greek, a generous and clear-sighted eye, symbolizing moral integrity, sincerity, and openness. And the evil eye, or paneros in the Greek, a corrupted, selfish, and envious eye, representing greed, jealousy, and a hardened heart. Meaning in Jewish thought, the healthy eye represents generosity, sincerity, and moral compass that seeks to do good for others, where the evil eye represents selfishness, greed, envy, and inward focus that only sees the world in terms of personal gain. Biblical examples. We see in Proverbs 22:9, the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Deuteronomy 15:9, be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year of canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites. In Proverbs 28:22, the stingy are eager to get rich and are unaware that poverty awaits them. Application in first century context. Jesus' Jewish audience would have immediately recognized the symbolism of the healthy eye and a call to generosity in a life devoted to God, rather than to material wealth. Matthew 6:19 through 21. Jesus' teaching, not only storing up treasures on earth but in heaven, directly connect with the imagery of the healthy eye, a clear, generous heart, and the evil eye, self-centered, materialistic focus. Jesus contrasts righteous living, the good eye, with the selfishness and greed seen in the evil eye. Closing thought. The eye acts as a conduit, revealing the state of our hearts by reflecting the light within us. What we choose to focus on, whether it's generosity or selfishness, shapes how we engage with the world. A healthy eye allows God's light to shine through, leading us toward righteousness and wholehearted devotion to Him. On the other hand, an evil eye distorts that light, clouding our vision with greed, envy, and materialism. And Jesus calls us to cultivate a clear eye, on that reflects His light and draws us into deeper generosity and commitment to His will. Ultimately, the condition of our eyes what we value and prioritize, reveal the true condition of our hearts. Are we reflecting light generously and moral clarity, or are we veiled by selfishness and envy? Jesus invites us to live with a healthy eye, focused on his kingdom, where spiritual wealth far outweighs earthly possessions. Historical context, point number 2. Light and darkness as spiritual metaphors. Light symbolizes truth, wisdom, and divine presence. Darkness represents sin, ignorance, and rejection of God's revelation. And seeing the light signifies spiritual awakening and acceptance of truth. The Jewish perspective. Light is seen as God's presence, wisdom, and guidance, as we see in Isaiah 9:2. And darkness is seen as sin, ignorance, and separation from God. Wisdom of Solomon 17:1-3. The Messianic hope. The coming of the Messiah brings light to those in spiritual darkness. The Dead Sea Scrolls, sons of light versus sons of darkness. And the Greco-Roman perspective. Light, symbol of knowledge, enlightenment, and virtue in philosophy. See Plato's allegory of the cave. Darkness was seen as ignorance, false beliefs, and moral confusion. Moral clarity was seen as gaining wisdom and aligning with divine truth. Application in the first century context. Luke presents light versus darkness as a metaphor for spiritual vision and perception. And Jesus' words serve as a rebuke to those rejecting his message. Gentiles in Luke's audience, familiar with the philosophical ideas of enlightenment, would have recognized the significance of Jesus as the ultimate source of truth and wisdom. Closing thought. Jesus' teaching on light and darkness is a timeless call to self-examination. Are we allowing God's truth to illuminate our hearts, or are we remaining in spiritual blindness? True transformation begins when we open our eyes to Christ, the light of the world, and let him guide our path. Historical context, point number 3. Economic and social context of first century Palestine. Factor. Extreme wealth inequality, heavy taxation, Roman and temple taxes, and corruption among religious leaders. Impact on Jesus' audience. A small elite controlled most of the land and resources, and many peasants struggled to survive under financial burdens, leading to frustration and economic despair. Pharisees and Sadducees were often accused of exploiting the poor. How it relates to the passage. The evil eye represented greed, a major issue in first century society, and Jesus calls for trust in God rather than hoarding wealth. In Luke's version, Jesus criticizes materialism and spiritual blindness. Application in the first century context. The healthy eye represents those who trust God and share with the poor. The evil eye symbolizes greedy individuals and corrupt leaders who hoard wealth instead of helping others. Jesus challenges both the wealthy and the religious elites to embrace generosity. Closing thought. Jesus' teachings confront a system built on greed and exploitation, calling his followers to a radically different way of life, one marked by trust in God, generosity, and care for the oppressed. His words remain just as relevant today, urging us to examine where we place our trust and how we steward what we have. Historical context, point number 4. Placement in Matthew versus Luke and its first century meaning. Matthew 6:22-23. Historical context. Part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus warns against materialism and divided devotion. Its meaning for first century audience. It was a call to single-minded devotion to God rather than wealth. The eye represents spiritual focus, either directed toward God and righteousness or greed and worldly gain. In Luke 11:33-36, we see the historical context as following Jesus condemning those who demand signs. See Luke 11:29 through 32, which emphasized the need for spiritual recognition. And the meaning for the first century audience, it was a call to spiritual openness, those rejecting Jesus and choosing spiritual darkness. The eye represented one's ability to perceive truth. Those who fail to recognize Jesus remain spiritually blind. Closing thought. While both accounts use the eye as a metaphor, Matthew's version focuses on devotion versus greed, while Luke's account emphasizes spiritual sight versus blindness. In both cases, Jesus' call or calls people to open their eyes to the truth, whether that means seeking God over wealth or recognizing Jesus as the true light. Next, we'll summarize the historical meaning of these passages before exploring their modern application. Historical context conclusion. Main theme. Jesus uses the eye as a metaphor for spiritual clarity and moral integrity. The contrast between light and darkness illustrates the importance of right perspective in one's relationship with God. Matthew's account, in Matthew 6:22 through 23, focuses on the choice between God and wealth, a healthy eye, and represents righteousness, generosity, and devotion to God, while an evil eye symbolizes greed and materialism. Jesus calls his followers to serve God wholeheartedly rather than being consumed by earthly riches. And Luke's account, in Luke 11:33 through 36, emphasizes spiritual awareness versus blindness, recognizing Jesus as the light. A healthy eye means accepting Jesus and living in his truth, while a darkened eye represents rejection of Christ and spiritual ignorance. Closing thoughts. In the first century context, Jesus' words challenged people to choose between light and darkness, righteousness and sin, devotion to God or worldly pursuits. These same choices remain relevant today, shaping how believers view and interact with the world. In this next section, we will talk about this next question and topic. How do these teachings apply in a modern world filled with distractions, materialism, and shifting values? And we'll explore practical applications for believers today.